And now I'd like to introduce Joshua Rubinstein, the Northeast Regional Director of Amnesty International USA and an associate at Harvard's Davis Center for Eurasian and Russian Studies. He's the official Amnesty spokesman for the region and participates in and organizes numerous human rights activities at the national and international level. His most recent book is Leon Trotsky, A Revolutionary's Life. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Rubinstein.
Welcome, everyone. I want to thank our friends here at the Harvard Bookstore. We've worked with them off and on for years, hosting events like this, and we're very pleased to be back today in Harvard Square. Professor Kantstroom has written really an extraordinary book, and the second of dealing with this issue. He is the professor of law, director of the International Human Rights Program, and associate director of the Boston College Center for Human Rights and International Justice. He's written widely on many issues relating to the law, but particular emphasis on immigration, detention, and he's not only a scholar in the field, but he's also an activist. I hope he doesn't mind my calling him that. He helps to direct the Immigration Clinic. The clinic is one of the many fine examples of the immigration bar here in Boston, where we're very blessed with a very strong group of advocates who really step up to defend immigrants and refugees here in Boston. This issue is very close to the heart of Amnesty International as well. When we defend immigrants and refugees, we're not only talking about a very vulnerable group of people here in the United States, but the largest populations of people who've been displaced across the borders of their own country are in other parts of the world, in Africa, for example. But nonetheless, when it comes to the United States, we're talking about millions of people who are here, often, of course, without the proper documentation. And then the question is, well, what happens to them in our system of laws, in our system of institutions? And what happens to these hundreds of thousands each year who are forced under law to leave the country? And there are also hundreds of thousands who leave, quote unquote, voluntarily, obviously some form of coercion, but nonetheless voluntarily, with the thought that perhaps it will make it easier for them to return. So this is a very difficult issue in the United States. At the national level, we are debating many issues relating to immigration now between President Obama and Governor Romney. And I expect we'll always be hearing about this issue, frankly. There's no easy resolution. But perhaps one of the most tragic dimensions is one of deportation, and just how many people are affected by it, and the effect on their lives and the lives of their families. And that's what we're here to learn more about today. Professor Kantstroom.
Thank you. It's really just such a great pleasure to be here today. I was just thinking about how many hours I've spent in the lower floor collecting works of John Irving and Faulkner and Rilke that I never read, but always get half price and have these great collections of things. And I'm really pleased to see so many friends and children of friends and new friends. The subject that I want to talk to you about today is not a happy subject, but as Josh said, I think it's a very important subject. And it's also a very complicated subject. I usually spend about a year confusing my students about this subject, but I'm going to try and confuse you in about 30 minutes. I also usually use a PowerPoint with this, but I was told that that wouldn't fit well here, and that deprives me of saying that, as Bismarck once put it, that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So we'll do without it. The big question that I wanted to confront in this book is, how has deportation worked in a country that styles itself a nation of immigrants? And I start from the proposition that the idea of being a nation of immigrants is both an empirical fact, and it has considerable importance that way, but it's also a very important idea. It's the governing national mythology of the United States. And there are many things that flow from that as governing national mythology. And of course, by mythology, I don't mean anything fictional. I mean, it's the sense that we have of who we are, and that has important implications in terms of ideas like dynamism and fluidity and pluralism and the way that the nation conceives of itself. You can understand that very well if you compare it to other forms of national mythology, which could be race-based or ethnic-based or religiously based. I think this nation of immigrants idea is very profound, and it's still true. So even though the story that I'm going to tell about deportation is a dark story, really, and I think a rather tragic story, the background fact of it, and maybe this renders it more tragic, I think, but it certainly renders it more nuanced and interesting, is that we are a nation of immigrants. We have non-immigrant admissions in this country, over 100 million people per year, considerably more than that actually, coming in and out as tourists and students and workers. We have permanent residents, so-called, coming in, lawful permanent residents, people with green cards, about 1 million people per year. We have a very large population of foreign-born. I'll tell you some more about that as we go forward. We have a relatively open naturalization system compared to many countries. It's not perfect. It's expensive here. There are problems with it, but by comparative measure, it's pretty good. And yet, and we also have a relatively generous refugee policy, actually. We take in about 80,000 per year. Not enough by my estimation, but still pretty good by comparative measures. We have a relatively open and well-run asylum system for people who are fleeing persecution and want to come here. Again, certainly not perfect. There's a lot of problems in it, but pretty good. And so I think this idea of a nation of immigrants is an important starting point. And yet, as I say in the book, I quote Marshall McLuhan for the proposition that I don't know who discovered water, but I know it wasn't a fish. This is my operating thought about this, that I was swimming in this sea of deportation for years as a lawyer, as a teacher, and I was never quite able to get out of the fishbowl and ask, where did this come from? Why is it the way that it is? And the where does it come from part was a previous book that I wrote that was called Deportation Nation, that tried to trace the history of this system, and I actually tried to connect it to things that are not normally connected with deportation, to things like fugitive slave laws and the removal of the Cherokee and colonization plans that were supported by politicians ranging from Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln, in fact. And the argument in that book was that deportation is best understood as being about more than immigration. It's not just about border control. It tells us something fundamental about the nature of the society that we have. And that's the idea that I wanted to pick up on with this book, which, as you can see, is called Aftermath. And the idea of this book was to figure out, what has this system wrought? How can we evaluate it? How can we assess its accomplishments? And I try to give voice to the people who support this system and ask the question, what would the proponents of deportation say that its goals were? And it turns out this is rather difficult to assess, more difficult than you would think for reasons I'll describe. In any case, most people, when they think about what's going on with immigration, think about something like this. This is a wonderful picture that was in the New York Times of the dreamers, so-called, young people who it's just amazing to look at their faces and realize these are the absolute best of the best among the undocumented, if we were to engage in such terminology. But these are young people who have been successful by any possible measure under extraordinary difficult circumstances. And finally, in the last months of the last year of the administration, for which there was so much hope from these people, they've been given a way out of the shadows. And it's a very tentative way, and it's only good for 2 years, and there's problems with it, but still, that's an extraordinary thing. But other people, when they think about this situation, think about something more like this, which is illegal aliens. And this picture reflects some of the problem that we have in thinking about this system. First of all, aliens in English is a very problematic word. It has implications of not only extraterrestrial, but of being something other than us, something maybe biologically fundamentally different. Other languages don't have this problem as such necessarily, although there are variations of this problem in other languages. But the terminology implies, I think, some of the viciousness and the starkness of the discourse about immigration and about people who are in this country without documents. I have challenged my students to come up with better phraseology for this, a better way to describe people than illegal aliens, partly because of aliens and partly because I don't like the idea that illegality can be an existential condition. I think when you say that something is illegal, you should be talking about conduct that is illegal. Somebody could do an illegal act. But to say that a person in their very being is illegal is a very, very powerful indictment, particularly in a country like this one, where in addition to being a nation of immigrants, we're a nation of law, and we respect law, and the idea of being within the law is very deep in the American gene pool and the idea. So to say that people are illegal aliens is really a way of distancing them from community in so many ways. So my students settled on the term documentarily challenged, and I'll offer that as a possible corrective if you want to accept it. Anyway, a big part of the immigration story is the illegal aliens, the documentarily challenged, the people who are out of status. And there are many millions of those kind of people living among us. In fact, I would bet that in every, probably not in this bookstore, but probably in virtually every restaurant around us here, there are people who don't have documents, who are working, who are cleaning, who are cooking, who are doing all kinds of things, driving. So this is a very pervasive phenomenon, and they live amongst us. But there's also another part of the deportation story that's less well known. And I will, in the book, I actually use a composite description of a number of clients, but I'll just tell you about one. And I see that Rachel is here. And this is a case that she actually worked on, Rachel Rosenblum, with our post-deportation project. The client's name was Marco. And he came to this country when he was a very young child and lived here, grew up here, attended school with his family and community, and had a couple of small problems with the law. And I don't mean that euphemistically, actually, they were really small problems with the law. He got caught with one little marijuana cigarette and one tab of LSD. Not a good thing. You know, I don't encourage it, but by the standards of criminality, pretty small. And then when he was in his mid-20s, he decided to go back to his home country for a visit to see his family, and he did that. And when he tried to come back in, he was immediately arrested and incarcerated and shipped to a remote detention center and told that he was going to be deported and separated from everything that he knew in this country forever. And in fact, that's what happened to him. He tried to fight it, but the laws have gotten to the point where often you cannot fight these things. There just can be no defense. And so he ended up getting deported. And this was a very harsh thing. And it became particularly harsh in our estimation when he contacted us and said that he had just learned that his mother, who lived in Florida, had died, and he wanted to come back to the U.S. just temporarily for her funeral. And we couldn't even do that. I mean, the system has gotten so harsh to the point where you cannot do these kinds of things for anybody. So cases like that, there are just so many of them that I don't want to burden you by reiterating them over and over. But this has been going on for now almost 20 years in increasing harshness. And the fact is that if we look at it holistically, I think we have to say that the United States is engaged in a radical social experiment. And it's radical by any historical or any comparative measure that you could think of in terms of its scope, its ferocity, the anomalous nature of what we are doing to people outside of the regular protections of the rule of law. It is really quite extraordinary. And part of what is most extraordinary about it, in my experience, is how few people really know what is going on. And this gets back to the water and fish problem. We've been living with this, and immigrant communities certainly know what's going on. And if I give talks to immigrant groups or in communities like Miami or Los Angeles, where there are a lot of, or in Arizona or Texas for that matter, people feel it. But most people who are not personally affected by this, most U.S. citizens, really do not have a sense of how stark these things are. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book is call awareness to this problem, and also to give voice to the deportees, to try to get people to understand that these are human beings with complicated life stories, and those voices need to be heard. What I also try to do in the book is situate this against the backdrop of U.S. history. And so I think what we're dealing with, as I said before, is this real deep tension between the idea of a nation of immigrants, which is open, welcoming. George Washington said in 1783 to a group of Irish immigrants, quote, "The bosom of America is open to receive not only the opulent and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges." That's an extraordinary statement, and he was saying that in 1783, this is before even the Constitution is ratified, and nobody would have argued with him about that at that time. But the rest of the statement, the last clause, he says, "If by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. So there's always been this tension, this idea between welcoming, but also saying we also have to distinguish the good ones from the bad ones. We have to have this sifting function. And I argue that that is a lot of what deportation is about. It's the mechanism that mediates between our highest aspirations and our most base impulses or our greatest fears. And this is part of the question, is how can we theorize about deportation? How can we understand it? And I argue that deportation is comprised of two different mechanisms that actually should be distinguished when we talk about it. One mechanism, which I call extended border control deportation, is what happens to the documentarily challenged, to the people who have crossed the borders without papers and who are living amongst us, some for many years. If you think about that form of deportation, it's not too hard to answer the question, why do we do that? We do that because we have a nation state, and the nation state has borders, and people have voted to control those borders and to say we are a nation state, and so it's logical and I think in some sense legitimate to say that if people have evaded those controls, particularly if they've done it not by being compelled to do it, but they've done it voluntarily, that you need to have some mechanism to redress that after the fact and to catch them. So if you believe in the nation state, which I do with qualifications, then I think you can accept that form of deportation. Of course, you might then say, maybe there should be a statute of limitations for that, like there is for virtually every crime except murder? That's one thought that might come to mind. Should there be some balancing that we look at, like why did the person come here? Did they have family? What would it mean if they were, all those things. But those are secondary questions, I think. The basic purpose of it is to protect the border. But this other form of deportation that I was talking about before with Marco, which I call post-entry social control deportation, I think is a whole other kettle of fish and is much harder to understand why we do that. It really has nothing to do with border control. It really has nothing to do with the nation state. It has to do with this idea of citizenship as full membership, which maybe in some way has something to do with the nation state, but it's really quite a secondary thing, and in many countries and in many other legal systems, it is considered to be a form of double punishment. So the idea, as we do in this country, that a person would be convicted of a crime, serve their sentence, do their time, pay whatever it is, and then, in addition to that, get deported, would be considered something akin to double jeopardy or double punishment and illegitimate and very problematic. And yet this is what we do to many, many tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people each year. So I think if we understand these two forms, we can begin to develop something of a better critique and understanding of what it is that's been going on. So I offer four sort of polemical assertions about deportation in this book. The first is, as I said before, that the deportation system is an enforcement mechanism. It's about power. It implicates more than immigration status. There's more going on there than border control. The second point is that it is highly anomalous, which is to say that, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, and I tell my students, if you want to understand immigration law, forget everything you think you know about constitutional law. Forget everything that you think you know about human rights, because deportation law is anomalous in a way that really only war on terror law rivals it, you know, in terms of Guantanamo. It's very peculiar, and there are historical reasons for that, which I can explain more when in questions if you like, but it is highly anomalous. It's also much larger than most people think, and it implicitly challenges powerful societal values and basic human rights. And then the final assertion, which is really a lot of what this book is about, is that we have created something that I call a new American diaspora. And I use that term very guardedly and very advisedly. I think it's a very complicated term. There's been a lot of scholarship about. In fact, there's one article that's called the Diaspora that says people are using the word diaspora so much that the term itself is out in a diaspora. And I'd be happy to defend it in more nuance than I'm about to, but the headline of it is that diaspora essentially means, and this goes back to the Old Testament and the dispersion of the Jews from Babylon, and it was used to describe Armenians and various other groups historically. Essentially, I think the functional basic meaning of diaspora is a forcibly displaced population that has maintained strong ties to what its people recognize as their homeland. Now, historically, those ties have tended to be religious, racial, ethnic, that sort of thing, and that's not what we're talking about here, although in some sense it actually is, because if you look at the the racial composition of the deportees, you will find it is by far mostly people of color who are being deported. Of course, it's also true that it's mostly people of color who are immigrating here. So again, this is a complex reality that we have to think about. I'll talk more about that too as we go forward. Anyway, the second point about diaspora is that the U.S. deportees, the people who are being deported, have been brought up, socialized, acculturated, have their families in the United States. This is despite their lack of formal legal citizenship status, but they are functionally Americans. There are millions of people who fit that description. And they then get forcibly uprooted from the place where they have these deep, cohesive social and cultural connections, and they get sent somewhere else. And I have explored a lot of these places, and when you talk to a lot of these deportees, I was just writing something about the group that really illustrates it most strongly is a group of deportees in the Azores, which are islands off the coast of Portugal. I mean, you go there, you talk to these guys, all they want to talk about is the Red Sox, and they want to talk about Teddy Ballgame, and they want to talk about, you know, is Menino, that idiot, still mayor? And, you know, these are deportees, and their focus is still, it's all back in Boston. And they have Boston accents, and they, you know, and yet there they sit. And you find people like this all over the world. You can find them in Cambodia, you can find them in Jamaica, you can find them in all sorts of places. And we have a project that is actually working with them and looking for them. So, what about that idea that so many people are coming in? The truth is that the population of the United States, the foreign-born population now, is at the highest level it has been historically. It's the same as around 1910. So we do have a very large foreign-born population, but in 1910 we didn't have deportation. We didn't have anything remotely comparable to deportation. So during the period that's known as the development of the nation of immigrants, the late 19th, early 20th century, this is when all of our, you know, grandparents, or at least mine, were getting on boats or being driven out of Odessa, where my grandmother was driven out of. I keep meeting people from countries out of which my ancestors were driven, which is a complicated conversation to have. But they didn't face deportation. Once they got here, they were pretty much here, with some exceptions, in particular the Chinese. Anyway, this is a very different kind of a system that we have now. And how big is it? Well, I think this presents a methodological problem. How do you measure the size of a system? And I think there are basically two ways to do it. One is you could ask, how large is the population of the foreign-born over whom the deportation system governs? Because when I talk to foreign-born people, often the first thing they are worried about is, would I face deportation? People are really scared about that. And it's really the most salient part of the rule of law that they often have to think about. How do I stay in status? If I travel, am I going to be allowed back in? Am I going to get caught? Am I going to get arrested? What if I donate money to this charity? What if this? What if that? There's roughly about 38 million foreign-born people in the United States. So that's a pretty sizable percentage of the population for whom deportation is really the largest part of the rule of law. And as I said, there's about 160 million non-immigrants coming in every year. That's a fluid population, but again, those are the ones who are coming in as workers and students and tourists. Again, for them, deportation is law. And we have about 1 million legal immigrants arriving every year with green cards, millions more in various complicated statuses. Anyway, upwards of 50 million or more people at any one moment are subject to deportation in this country. But I don't think that's the most salient way to describe how large the system is. Here's a way. Since 1980, the number of times that there's been a deportation event on U.S. soil, that is, somebody has been caught and ordered by government agents by one mechanism or another to leave, that number has exceeded 35 million events. So that, to my mind, is a pretty big system, 35 million encounters. Now, smart people have told me that this doesn't really prove what I said it proved, because it could have been one Mexican who was encountered 34,999,000 times, which is possible, but I think unlikely. So we don't actually know how many people face this, but we do know how many events. And I think that gives you some sense. In the last report that just came out, And actually, these numbers are up during the Obama administration, by the way. The deportations are up. Many people probably know that already. The detentions are at an all-time high. We had 429,000 detentions last year for immigration purposes by the Obama administration. And we had 324,000 returns, which is a form of ordering somebody to leave but saying you can do it on your own dime, and 392,000 removals, so upwards of 700,000. The question then comes, does it work? Why are we doing this? And it turns out that the more we have studied this, and there's actually now very good social science investigations into this, it turns out that it actually does not seem to have done much of anything good. The extended border control form of deportation seems not to have worked because the undocumented population has been growing dramatically, even during this period of stepped-up enforcement during the Bush administration. Doug Massey at Princeton has argued, I think persuasively that economic factors and actually various sociological factors in Mexico are much more important to controlling the size of the undocumented population than deportation is. It may be that building a wall, if we could ever do that on the border, and we'd have to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to do it, and I doubt it would even work then, that might have some effect. And of course, it is true that maybe the population would be somewhat larger if we hadn't deported all those people, although I spent time in Guatemala interviewing a lot of deportees who were right on their way back. I mean, people say, look at the life that I have here, and I'll take that chance again. And most immigration agents know that there's a lot of people who keep coming back. So it doesn't seem that that form of deportation has really accomplished very much. And what about the other form of deportation? Oh, by the way, what's the spending on immigration enforcement just for you taxpayers who might care about this? The last budget, I think, I actually have the 2010 budget, about $17 billion that we're spending on immigration enforcement. The phrase among people who practice in this field is that the agents have more money than God. But I don't know how God spends the money. They actually have so much money that they often spend a lot of time figuring out what new mechanisms can we come up with to spend our money. How can we give it to state and local police? How can we, there's all kinds of things going on. I mean, if you want to invest in something, you can invest in deportation. At least for the past few years, that would have been a good bet. So what about the other form? Well, it seems to me that the best argument you could make for that kind of deportation is crime control. You want to say, well, we're deporting criminals, and the Obama administration said we deported last year 188,000 criminal aliens. And criminal alien is not a thing that you want to be called, nor a thing that you want to live with necessarily. I mean, that sounds pretty bad, a criminal alien. Who wants criminal aliens in their communities? I don't, probably you don't, but the fact is that the vast majority of criminal aliens have been deported for minor drug offenses, traffic violations, and immigration-related offenses, which is kind of circular if you're going to call them criminals and you're deporting them because of immigration violations. I'm just saying that it doesn't, if you're thinking about how do we justify this, that's a little bit problematic. Researchers have begun to look into this. Sociologists, Ruben Rimbaud is probably the main one who has done a lot of work on this, and they have discovered that the single best predictor of criminal behavior after gender, which is the single best predictor, I mean, differentiated. Men are much more likely to commit crimes than women. But after that, the single best predictor is length of time living in the United States. And in fact, being a U.S. citizen seems to make people much more likely to commit and be convicted of crimes. There is no immigrant crime problem, he said. The rate of crime among immigrant communities is much lower than it is among U.S. citizen communities. And there's other things one could say about this, but the conclusions have been that if there was an immigrant crime problem, as Rimbaud wrote in one paper, it was not found among the immigrants, but among their U.S.-born sons, who are U.S. citizens. So whatever you may think about that problem and how you might address it, deportation doesn't seem to be the way to address it. Because you can't deport the sons. You can't deport the U.S. citizen children who are growing up in poor communities. Now, last thing, and then I'll wrap it up. How does the system work? I said it was anomalous, and by that I mean a lot of different things. But for one thing, many people who face deportation have no right to bail. They get arrested, they get incarcerated. I had a client 13 years ago who was arrested when she went for a check-in at immigration. She walked in, she had been convicted of shoplifting That was her criminal record. She checked in. She'd been checking in all along, but suddenly they said, no, we're arresting you. They arrested her on the spot. They said, your next hearing date is 15 months from now. They sent her to detention. She had gone in for her check-in date with her 8-day-old baby who she was breastfeeding. They took the baby away from her. They said, call a grandmother, somebody to get the kid. And they said, you'll see a judge in 15 months. Now, we were able to shorten that and actually get her out, but there are a lot of people who don't have lawyers. And that's the other thing. You have no right to counsel. If you cannot afford a lawyer in deportation proceedings, you will not have one. And there's very good data now about the difference that lawyers make. It's quite stunning. The likelihood of successfully defending a deportation case is remarkably different if you have a lawyer versus if you don't. People have minimal Fourth Amendment rights. ICE agents can break into your bedroom and they can find papers there, and they can use those papers to prove that you're deportable. And if that were any kind of a criminal case at all, even the most minor case, the Fourth Amendment exclusionary rule would prevent the government from using illegally seized evidence. But in deportation proceedings, it doesn't work that way. They can use it unless somebody, and it would have to be a lawyer, can show that this was an egregious violation or that there's some widespread practice. It's a much higher standard. And finally, deportation can be retroactive. That is really harsh because it means that if you were, for example, caught with a marijuana cigarette and you go to a lawyer and you say, well, they're offering me a plea deal where it goes away and I have no criminal record and I just should do it, will I get deported? And the lawyer looks it up and says, no, you're fine, take the deal, you're not going to get deported. 10 years later, the Congress can pass a law that says anybody who took a plea like that 10 years ago is now deportable, even though it was not a deportable offense at the time when they did it. So that's pretty weird from a rule of law perspective. And in the book, I talk a lot about how this rule of law discourse, because people say, well, they violated the law. But the rule of law is complicated. And people say they violated the law, period, you know, as if that ends the discussion. And what I'm saying is that after you say that somebody has broken the law, what follows is not a period, it's a question mark. And the question is, what should we do about it? And this implicates a whole lot of other ideas within the rule of law that in the last chapter of the book I talk about. Ideas of proportionality, ideas of anti-discrimination, ideas of protecting the family. Actually, U.S. deportation law is remarkably unprotective of the family. We know now that hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizen children have had their parents deported. We also know that there are many U.S. citizen children who go with their parents. So in Guatemala now, there are U.S. citizens who are growing up as Guatemalans. So it works both ways. In the Cambodian community, there are many elderly parents who have been left without the son that they thought was going to take care of them in their old age. That's a very tragic thing. A lot of these sons who were carried in their mother's arms out of the killing fields, fleeing genocide, come to this country, thought they were United States citizens, never took the steps that would have been relatively easy to get U.S. citizenship, get into some kind of trouble, again, often very minor, sometimes serious, often very minor, and find themselves in Phnom Penh, where they don't speak the language, they don't know anybody, and they're out in the fields. So there's been more and more studies of this, and again, all I'm trying to do is raise consciousness about this and get people to think seriously about it. And there is, fortunately, a growing body of work now that's developing around this idea, including measuring the effects of deportation, trying to reform the system, looking around the world in these diaspora communities to see. We have a center, actually, we have a program in Guatemala where deportees can come in, they can be counseled, they can get advice. If they have questions, they can actually contact a staff attorney that we have. So, and there are more and more of these kinds of things developing. But still, the reality is just as harsh as it is little known. And I have one way of capturing that, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. One of the most famous books that was ever written about deportation was a book that was called The Deportation's Delirium of 1920. It was written by a guy named Louis Post, who was the commissioner of immigration at the time. And he had to preside over, actually, it was the rise of the career of the young J. Edgar Hoover, who began his career as a deportation agent. And Hoover was deporting communists, socialists, anarchists, Reds, he called them, including Emma Goldman, who I hope some of you have heard of. And Post said this was so harsh that he called it a deportation's delirium. And in fact, there were others who wrote petitions about it. Felix Frankfurter challenged it. A lot of the leading legal minds of the day said, this is just really beyond the pale. You cannot do this. Well, in 1920, which was the year of the deportation's delirium, The total number of deportations in the United States was 14,557. Immigrant admissions in that year, 430,000. So the ratio, I want to come back to the beginning point that I was saying, the ratio, how do we understand the relationship between the nation of immigrants and the deportation nation? The ratio at that time was 3 deportations to 100 admissions. Now, since 1996, we have lawful permanent resident admissions, about 14 million, deportations, removals, and returns, about 21 million. The current ratio now is 144 to 100. So we've gone from 3 to 100 during a deportations delirium to 144 to 100. I think that's a delirium in itself. And when you see what happens to deportees around the world, you can really appreciate the harshness of this. Many of them face horrible violence. They're ostracized. They're completely severed from any social networks. Again, as I said before, no families. Mistreatment by police around the world is very common in places like El Salvador. In Haiti, there are people who were being held in medieval conditions, you know, diseases and corruption and violence. Of course, social ostracism. And it goes on, and perhaps the most galling part of it from a legal perspective, and this is why I started this post-deportation project in the first place, is the final idea that right now, for many of them, even though they can show that they should not have been deported in the first place, because the government theory of deporting them was wrong, the Supreme Court has recognized that in a series of cases, 8 to 1, 9 to nothing, the court says to the government, your theory is wrong. Drunk driving is not an aggravated felony, for example. It's not a crime of violence. Tens of thousands of people were deported by that theory before the court overturned it, and yet those people cannot reopen their cases. And they write letters to us, and they send us emails, and they say, I just read this case that said, just like me, it was just like me, I shouldn't have been deported. The Supreme Court said the government was wrong. I'd like to come back. How's that? I had a green card. These government agents ordered me deported, and now the court says they were wrong. And the current state of the law, for the most part, is that's it. The government gets to deport its mistakes, to bury its mistakes in some zone out there where there is no law. And to my mind, that's the same problem as Guantanamo. It's the fundamental problem of human rights in our time. It's the fundamental problem of the relationship between the nation state and the rule of law. It's much of what Amnesty International is about, and why I'm very glad that Amnesty and Josh have helped me come here today. I always finish these talks, and I will again, with a quotation from Justice Murphy in a case called Bridges versus Wixon, which involved Harry Bridges, who was a famous Australian union leader who endured a 30-year campaign of trying to get him deported. Ultimately, they lost. But Justice Murphy said, quote, "It is only by zealously guarding the rights of the most humble, the most unorthodox, and the most despised among us that freedom can flourish and endure in our land." And I think that's very important, because at the end of the day, what I want to suggest is that we should not care about this only for them. We should care about them. As I said, their voices are important. But really, we need to care about this for us. This is really about what kind of a country do we have? What kind of a conception of law do we have? What kind of people are we? And I think this is really central to that. So thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. I think there's a surprising consensus among activists in the field and both major political parties that what we need, first of all, is a recognition of the labor issues between the United States and Mexico and Central America. We need a system of labor, of visas for workers to be able to come in a legal status. As to the people who are here in undocumented status, we need some sort of a pathway to legalization. Even Mitt Romney said just yesterday, if I heard him correctly, that he said, of course, we're not going to deport all those other people. You know, we wouldn't do that. He doesn't want to say what he would do. But in the Bush administration, there was a pretty good tacit consensus between the Republicans and the Democrats. Some sort of earned program of legalization, maybe pay a fine. You know, it's not going to be costless, but do something to bring those people out of the shadows. Most people think we need better border control in the South, but of course that would be a lot easier to do if we had labor migration that could allow those people to come and work in the country in a legal way, as Mexicans and Central Americans had done for decades before this current system got to be the way that it is. I don't see why we have this post-entry social control deportation at all. So if I were king of the forest, I would urge people to ask the hard question, is this system really worth the money we're spending on it and the distortion to our legal system? I would think about abolishing it, but that would doom my chances for any political office in the real world. But I think those are the big pieces of it, and I will predict that no matter who wins this next election, we're going to see something like that, because I think that it's just obvious that that's the way we have to go. I try to be as fair and balanced as I can about things, but it just strikes me as remarkable that anybody could say that those kids, the ones who didn't come here themselves, they were brought here by their parents when they were babies, and they grew up here, what could possibly be gained by deporting those people? And yet even that, was a struggle for the administration to accomplish. So I think that confirms the intuition that there's a lot at stake in this debate. I think a lot of it has to do with anxiety, frankly, among the Caucasian population about the nature of the polity as it's developing, more Latinos, and so forth. So I think there's a lot going on here. But I don't see any chance that the Romney administration is going to engage in a massive roundup of people either. I don't think the Obama administration will, obviously. So, we could mark the beginning of this in different ways, but the fundamental legal thing was a package of laws that were passed in 1996 during the Clinton administration that actually were passed in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing. And those laws, which also contained some anti-terrorism provisions that later became quite important, changed the nature of the deportation system and actually made it easier to deport people for ever more minor crimes, eliminated a lot of the discretion that immigration judges had in the past to grant relief from removal for certain people. So that was kind of the watershed legal moment, although really that issue had started a few years before that. I think in 1986 there was this last big trade-off in the Reagan administration between the amnesty program, at that time it was called, which gave status to 4 million people, and the deal was we were going to get employer sanctions and a federalized system. The amnesty part worked out, but the employer sanctions didn't. And so prosecutors and people who were in support of immigration control began developing a kind of a wish list of how they wanted to harden the law, take away the discretion of the immigration judges, make it easier to deport ever larger numbers of people. And so they built in things like mandatory detention, which was put in that law, took away the discretion. And it kind of floated around for a few years. I actually remember this. I was teaching at the time, and we looked at this, a lot of us, and said, well, this could never come into law. They couldn't possibly do that. And then the Oklahoma City bombing happened, and in the first reports, if anybody remembers, were that the bombing was conducted by swarthy foreigners. That was the term on CNN, that somebody had seen a swarthy foreigner. And by the time the dust settled, this package had worked its way into an omnibus budget measure that, to this day, most of the people who voted for it will say they really didn't know what they were voting for, and a lot of them have regretted it since then. In fact, some of them have written letters saying, I never thought this would apply to my constituents, like when it's their son-in-law or something that gets deported. Even some people who have signed these laws have now come back and said they wouldn't have signed it. But they did, and Clinton signed it, and that really changed the system. And ever since then, the deportation trend lines have been up and up. But this also actually fits with a larger narrative, because actually I was just giving this talk about a week ago, and Mary Waters, who's a sociologist at Harvard, was pointing out that the trend line of deportation, the dramatic rise of deportation over that period of time, actually coincides quite directly with the rising trend line of disenfranchisement of African American citizens and the increasing incarceration rates, and harsh drug laws. So there's a bigger story to tell, but the more specific legal story is what I was saying. That's a damn good question, and I don't personally know the answer to it. But when I looked at those cases, I certainly had exactly the same intuition that you did, that if that was any of my clients, I'm not sure what I would have done, But I know the judge who decided not to deport Obama's aunt, which was one of the cases that took place around here. And I have no personal knowledge of. In fact, I will tell you a story just to give you an example of how I think it's not exactly corruption, if that's what you're concerned about. Because when the aunt was arrested, I don't know if anybody remembers this, it was before the election. And I actually was in touch with the campaign myself, and I remember calling them and saying, I'm an immigration lawyer, I support Obama. If you need any help, I'd be happy to do it. Pro bono, I'll go into court. They said, he doesn't want to touch it, he doesn't want to know about it, he doesn't want to hear about it, thank you very much, click. And the next thing I know, you know, they had retained counsel, but somebody else. So I think the campaign really wanted to stay away from it. But, you know, what immigration judges are relatively low-level federal employees, by the way. That's another thing. They're not Article III judges. They don't have life tenure. They work in the Justice Department. So the idea that an immigration judge is going to sign the order of deportation of the president's aunt, that would be a move that would require some pretty big cojones, you know? Yeah. I don't want to get into this too much because it's very abstract, but actually I will say I have a colleague named Kevin Kenny who teaches history at Boston College who's working on a little book now. Oxford Press has a series called was the very short introduction to X, Y, or Z, and he's doing a very short introduction to Diaspora. And my first reaction was better you than me because it really is complicated. But the basic two questions are, should we look at diaspora as a concept that is connected to its roots, which were religious and among Jewish people? And of course, there's a question of how we understand what it means to be Jewish. Is that a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a tribal grouping? So there was always this ambiguity. But what there wasn't at that time was a nation state or a conception, a legal conception of citizenship. So I think diaspora is a very interesting rhetorical concept that actually evolves over time, and we have to take account of the changing background norms of the nation state, of what it means to be a citizen, and of what it means to be connected to a community. And in a nation of immigrants, it is fundamentally not an ethnic or racial or religious idea. So it seems to me we have a community in this country. These people have been a part of it. We have welcomed them into it, and now they have that still that strong sense of identity and cohesion, and they have been diasporaed. Now, can you be diasporaed, I'm using this as a verb advisedly, from a country or a place in which, by definition, by positive law, you were not accepted in the first place? It's like the reverse, I think I say in the book, it's like the reverse of the Groucho Marx problem. You know, he said, I wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have me as a member. And it's kind of similar to that in a way. But I think this is also part of a bigger story about the functional meaning of borders and the relationship of people to various places. And I think we have to maintain a humane conception of it. So diaspora is kind of an epithet. I mean, it's almost an accusation when you say that this is a diaspora. That's how I'm using it. I'm saying that we have done something that is really fundamentally harsh and harmful to these people, and it's analogous to what happened to the Armenians. Or, I mean, the roots of it are the dispersion. You know, the spora is you know, seeds, and the dispersion of the group. So I think that's what we're doing. I mean, I realize it's a polemical usage, and I'd be happy to spend more time discussing it. I don't stand on it. You know, it's more of a claim than a provocative claim than it is something I'm positive is correct. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is part of an important change in our discourse, that belonging is not the same thing as citizenship. And identity is not the same thing as legal status. And community is not the same thing as citizenship or legal status. But I think that's part of a much larger narrative around the world. I mean, I begin the book by saying reports of the death of the nation state have been exaggerated. So I'm not one who thinks, this is not in the genre of, you know, globalization, because the nation state is the very thing that we're dealing with here. It's the reactionary power of the nation state that's so forceful here. On the other hand, the bigger picture is there's so many people now who are living in places where they weren't born, who are moving from one place to another, who have multiple nationalities, transnational connections, and all of that. So I think our understanding of human identity is very important. I conclude the book with a very odd case, which is a case called Nystrom versus Australia. Nystrom was a guy who grew up in Australia when he was a little kid, and he was convicted. He was Swedish. He was convicted of horrendous crimes, really bad criminal record, rape of a child, that sort of thing. So even though in the international human rights system, it does require some proportional balancing. You can't just deport somebody and say, let's look at how bad was the crime and how deep are his connections. Pretty much everybody agreed that if you're ever going to deport anybody for crime, you're going to deport this guy for crime. His lawyers came up with a creative theory, though, which had been kicking around for about 20 years before that, but never had gotten any traction so far as I'm aware. They said that under human rights law, there's a principle that says a person cannot be prevented from entering his own country. And they said at a certain point, we might just have to say that Australia is his own country. Much as we hate him, much as we hate what he did and we want to see him locked up or imprisoned as a sex offender, whatever you want to do to him, he's our problem. He's not somebody else's problem. And the Human Rights Committee actually accepted that proposition. There were dissents, but they accepted it. Australia then said, well, that's very nice. Go away. Tell me another one. But that tells you more about human rights law than anything else. But I think this is an evolving idea. Again, this idea of diaspora connects to the dreamers. I think that's right. I do think that. Yeah. I mean, I just don't think it's coincidental that the rise of this deportation system has been completely consonant at the same time as the racial composition of the immigrant flow to this country has changed. I just don't think that can be coincidental. I just think it's been easier for the majority population to accept this kind of thing when it's done to certain people. And I think that's true in the criminal justice system as well, which is why I think there is a connection between the disenfranchisement of African American men in this country, which is a huge problem and has been taking place during exactly the same historical period. I think these things are related. Does that mean that I think that immigration agents or people who support deportation are consciously racist? No, I'm not saying that. Some of them are, but I don't think that's the dominant reality. But I think there's more than there are deep reasons, and in my first book, which I don't think is for sale here, unfortunately, but you could get somewhere else, I try to make those connections. Always historically, the first deportation laws, the first exclusion laws, the reason the system is anomalous in the way that it is was because of laws that were passed against the Chinese. As Chinese, the law was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. The case was called the Chinese Exclusion Case. So there's always been a greater ease in this country to impose harsh deportation laws against people of color. And what happened here was that in 1965, the immigration laws of this country changed quite dramatically, so that what had been a rather racially restrictive flow, mostly Europeans coming in, changed. And we started having open Western Hemisphere immigration. That's been the reality since the late 1960s. And shortly after that, the massive deportation machinery starts getting put into place. And by the mid-'80s, it's already in place. And now it's just been metastasizing ever since. I just don't think that's a coincidence. And if you start parsing the discourse of people in places like Arizona, you know, where the rubber really meets the road of deportation more than it does around here in some ways, you just find that there is that kind of anxiety and there is that sense that these are some other kind of people. They're not quite American in the classic view of what an American is. Do I think that connects to some of the questions about Obama's birthplace and all of that? Absolutely. I mean, I think these things are all woven in, but I don't want to oversimplify it, you know, but I think that's a big part of it. And if you look at the statistics, the countries to which people are deported are, you know, all Latin America, China. I mean, it's not Europe. So res ipsa loquitur, we say in the law, the thing speaks for itself. Maybe it does. Yes, there's a professor named Mary Kroc who is doing great work of this type. There are a number of people. Actually, we have a person named Marianne Lockery who works at Boston College who's doing work like this, and there are a few other people. I think from what I hear, the debates and the tensions in Australia are quite strong also because Australia has a rather restrictive immigration policy, and particularly relating to asylum seekers. So I think the debates are, you know, always different but similar. I mean, of course, Australia only exists in its current demographic form because of deportation from the United Kingdom. So, you know, I don't know if that's an indelicate thing to point out to an Australian, but last question, yeah. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about secured communities, and it's very complicated, so I don't want to get too much into it, but basically, secured communities is not a substantive change in the law. It's just an efficiency mechanism of connecting databases and connecting police on the ground to immigration databases. So in terms of catching more people, it's more like the Arizona law. It's more like if you get stopped for some other reason. And by the way, this is partly also accounts for some of the racialized nature of the removal system, because the criminal system is also racialized, and there are disproportionate numbers of people of color who end up in criminal cases as well. And now, with the databases being connected so much better than they ever were before, they're more likely to end up in removal proceedings as well. The bigger story, I think, is not just secured communities, but it is that the strategy of the Obama administration has been and was to stop the workplace raids, which were the hallmark of the Bush administration, which were horrible, brutal events. And this idea they have of what they call smart enforcement is to deport people for crime. But what they don't like to discuss is what I was just saying, that the vast majority of the people that they're deporting for crime, in order to show their bona fides in terms of enforcement, in order to say we're not just pansies here, we're getting tough on somebody, but they're getting tough on minor offenders, and secured communities is part of that smart strategy of connecting all the dots. I've had clients who have ended up in proceedings due to convictions that were 35 and 40 years old. I mean, they're finding like old shoplifting cases from North Carolina, that we had one case we had to get the sheriff to write something out on a yellow legal pad to prove that the thing had been dismissed 35 years ago. So it used to be the system was quite messy and inefficient. It's much more efficient now. But efficiency is not the same thing as justice. So maybe we'll end with that point. Yeah, sorry to shock Ken. Thank you.